So you're here for automate the provisioning of secure developer environments on AWS. Nick Matthews, I'm a solutions architect for AWS. We're also here with Matt Kyle, who's Director of Product Marketing for Palo Alto, and John Plisker, who's from REAN Cloud. So I'm going to kick this off a little bit and give you some AWS background before we get started. So, some of the drivers that we see for AWS are, increased agility, flexibility, more capabilities, and the amount of services. AWS is now at over 90 services, being able to go global in minutes, right? So we've got 16 regions, which I'll get into that a little bit later. And paying for what you use. So it's a big sort of change from on-premises and other environments where you have to think a little bit more about what you're going to deploy and when. And we'll show how these things are important and how they also tie into security and some of the capabilities that the folks we're joined here today with Palo Alto. So if we take a look at sort of what a typical or a sort of standard sort of journey might look like is, a lot of people will find sometimes the developers will go out and start creating accounts and resources themselves just because their on-premises or available IT is just not moving fast enough, they're not scalable enough, or they're not flexible, or any of those sort of stuff. So dev and test or startups that don't have an IT organization to start off with, those are some of the common workloads that we see that come to AWS first. After that, people start really building their applications on AWS. This is where a lot of times your first native applications come from, either because they were sort of promoted from development into AWS, or the dev and test gave people enough confidence to build or migrate to AWS. And this is sort of where the core set of workloads that we're going to be talking about are at. There's the production application migration there. We get into sort of the cloud first. This is sometimes where entire enterprises will no longer go to their sort of virtualization farms for resources first. Now it's cloud first. You have to have a reason why you're not placing it on the cloud. And then once a lot of your resources are on AWS, then it's a lot of times of how do you change your business, or how do you change the way you do your operations, and how do you make sure that automation or DevOps and those kinds of things are really at the core part of what you're doing. And that's where a lot of the business benefits really start changing, as opposed to just sort of operating differently. One of the other things that we talk about a lot on AWS is security. So security is job zero for us. Every employee knows that security is part of their job, and we think there's a number of different reasons why we can do this more securely, that we can do it, in at least on premises. And that was backed by the CIO of Capital One last year during reInvent, that said they can operate their environments more securely on AWS than they can on premises. And there's a couple of reasons for that. Some of it's simplicity. Everyone knows that where there's complexity, security sort of lingers. The automation and logging that we do is a little bit different, and that has a big impact on security. Encrypting and making it easy to do the right security thing by default. All of our APIs or TLS, we make sure that encryption is built into our products, and that we don't allow for like weak authentication and those types of things. So just raising the bar on basic security principles makes a big difference in terms of how you operate securely. This is the shared security model. If you've heard AWS talk about security before, you've probably seen this, and it's really important. So the core concept here is that AWS manages security of the cloud, right? The infrastructure. So that means everything from the physical sort of concrete to the data centers themselves, to the hypervisors, to the underlying storage behind services like S3, to the the hypervisor that's running underneath our computing services like EC2, the core networking in and out of that environment. So the security of the cloud. So basically that infrastructure, and we can do a really good job at this because we have a lot more people dedicated to just securing that infrastructure than most people. And then the customer's responsibility is everything you sort of put on the cloud. So whatever you put in our systems is what you need to secure. So for instance, AWS, you can run a PCI application on AWS, but just because we can run it there doesn't mean your application is necessarily secure. So you're still responsible for making sure that you've got control of your data, you've got control of your identity and access management, you've got control of your network and firewall configuration, which is very applicable to what we're talking about today. You still have that security responsibility of securing the things you put in AWS. So for instance, you have to make sure your security group policies are strong, or your firewall policies are strong, since AWS won't do that for you. One other thing is monitoring. So everything on AWS is visible, so there's no servers hiding underneath desks or anything like that. But there's also things like CloudTrail that allow you to see all the API calls going in and out of your account at all times. We've got services like Inspector. You may have seen also Macy that allows you to do some data loss prevention. So we're also coming out with more security services to help you monitor your own network. In addition, availability is a huge part of security. So especially when you start thinking about things like distributed denial of service attacks. We run a very large network that has weathered the DDoS storms, and we're able to help you scale as well. So part of dealing with those types of attacks is also dealing with the scaling and the auto scaling and that flexibility. But there's also security concerns around where your data lives. So one of the ways that our system works is the data will not leave the region you place it in unless you tell us you want to be placed somewhere else. And being able to go global in minutes is awesome. So we've got 16 regions all around the world, and you can, as soon as you figure out how to deploy in one, you can sort of copy and paste it everywhere else. But then it's not just all about what you run in AWS. There's also the ability to go back on premises. So you can use services like Direct Connect, which allows you to connect into your global network. It allows you to use things like Advanced or Active Directory or your own DNS services. And as well as for those customers that are concerned about their data confidentiality or their data in general, we've got services like our key management service or our hardware-based key service that allows you to bring your own encryption keys to encrypt your own data. So on that line, there's a lot of certificates and plans and all these types of things that we can show you the papers for. So if you're worthy of credit about SOC 1, SOC 2, PCI, DSS at the highest levels, ITAR, FedRAMP, those kinds of things, PCI, HIPAA, we've got the sort of paperwork to back all these types of compliance programs. So that's sort of a primer on what we're working with at AWS. I'd like to introduce Matt Kyle from Palo Alto to sort of show us what they're working on.
Thanks very much, Nick, and thanks everyone for attending. So I'll spend about 5 to 7 minutes, just a brief overview of Palo Alto Networks so that we can hand it off to John Plisker, who's going to talk about how Gigamon is using Palo Alto Networks on AWS to secure their development environments. So Palo Alto Networks, is a next-generation firewall on AWS, and it's important for everyone to understand is, like Nick said when he talked about shared security model, it's beholden to you, the customer, to ensure that your applications and data are the target. And remember that hackers are location agnostic. They are not going to care whether their target, your credit card numbers, your intellectual property, your computing resources are located in AWS or in a private data center just down the hall on premises. Their role is to establish a foothold on your network in some way, shape, or form, navigate to a resource, and then execute their goal. So that methodology is exactly the same whether you're on premises or in the cloud. And remember that in most cases, if they establish a foothold on premises, they can find a way to get to the cloud because it's going to be connected through an IPsec VPN or perhaps AWS Direct Connect. So what we do is a next generation firewall on AWS. Common question is, how are we deployed? We are an EC2 instance deployed in your VPC. Our core capabilities is detecting the application, not the port, and then allowing you to set policies on that application to control traffic moving in and out of that VPC, and then preventing threats within that application flow. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the automation capabilities that REAN Cloud and Gigamon are taking advantage of to automate their deployment. So we already talked a little bit about this, and Nick did a very good job. So I highlighted where we can help with the shared security model. We can help secure your AWS environment. And when we talk about security, I've been working in this role for about 3 years, and when you look at the DevOps conversation and the security conversations, they don't necessarily align. As Nick pointed out earlier in his deck, DevOps is taking full advantage of the AWS agility and scalability, agility and flexibility. They're spinning up new environments, tearing things down, iterating very quickly. Security works on change control. It is an industry best practice. It's not meant to be detrimental to the environment, but security does practice change control. And therein lies the conflict. And the way to solve that conflict and bring the two groups together is through automation. So there are 3 features I'm going to talk about today very briefly. Bootstrapping is one of the key features, a fully documented XML API, and then dynamic policy updates. So these are features within the BM series next generation firewall. So the bootstrapping capabilities allows you to create a golden image, store that golden image that is completely configured. It's a completely configured firewall with routing, firewall licenses, security policies, and so on. You can store that golden image in an S3 bucket and then use CloudFormation templates or other automation tools to dynamically deploy the VM series firewall. And so this is one of the core features that REAN Cloud is going to talk about that Gigamon is taking full advantage of. The other piece here is a bi-directional XML API. So this can be used in a number of different ways. We can ingest information to dynamically update block lists. So if you're using a visibility tool that finds malicious DNS, you can conceivably import those DNS address, that DNS information into the policy and create dynamic block lists. Then you can export data. We currently actually have some integration that can export VM series metrics directly to AWS CloudWatch to use as part of the monitoring capabilities. We've integrated with ServiceNow and some other orchestration tools so that you can actually build an environment where the firewall is a part of the orchestrated environment. And then the last piece is we can actually ingest AWS tags into the policy updates so that those policies are dynamically updated. This is a really, really powerful feature. So think about this for a moment. Your developers are adding and removing workloads in their particular VPC. So in the old school days or in on-premises days, you might have to ask the security team to update those policies. In some cases, those policies might take a couple of days, and in really bad cases, it will take 2 to 3 weeks to update a security policy. That directly conflicts with the dynamic nature of the cloud. So now what we can do is you can tag those workloads using AWS tags. We can consume those tags as part of the security policy, and as those workloads are added and removed, the security policy is updated automatically, eliminating the change control process and eliminating potentially the commit process that a firewall needs to go through. So in the span of a couple of hours of setting up and configuring the effort, you can eliminate those security roadblocks from a DevOps environment. So those are the 3 features that that REAN Cloud is going to take full advantage of when they're talking about the Gigamon use case. So I'm going to hand it over to John Plisker, who is a solutions architect for REAN Cloud, and he's going to talk through the Gigamon use case. John?
Yeah, great. Thanks very much, Matt. Yeah, so John Plisker, Solution Architect with REAN Cloud. Thanks, everybody, for spending some time with us today. What we want to talk about is what we were able to do with Gigamon. But before I get into that, I just wanted to give you a little bit of background on who REAN Cloud is. You may or may not be aware of us, and highlight why we were able to help Gigamon and really what some of our credentials are in that regard. So specifically, REAN Cloud is a Amazon Web Services premier consulting partner. We focus 100% on the cloud. As a systems integrator, this is really all we do, and have a number of customers that we've worked with specifically on Amazon Web Services. Been around since 2013, and one of the things to highlight in terms of our size, we're 300 plus employees. And the majority of those employees carry technical certifications with cloud providers, specifically AWS. So we're very much a technical-oriented SI. We're the guys who like to get on the keyboard and implement this stuff. And then lastly, in terms of where have had some great deal of experience, is in industries that deal with regulation. And have certain compliance requirements. That's an area where we've got a great deal of experience. So life sciences, healthcare, financial services, and public sector. So that's kind of who REAN Cloud is, a cloud SI. In terms of what we're able to do with customers, we really can run them through the entire journey and life cycle. And so that could start with developing business cases and trying to calculate the return on investment in terms of migrating to the cloud. That could be assessing their current environments that are on-prem and building a plan in terms of how they can best get to the cloud. And then getting into very detailed architecture and design for how to take full advantage of the resources that AWS and our partners provide, such as Palo Alto Networks. Once we get the design in place and we've kind of done the paperwork, if you will, then we like to roll up our sleeves and actually get on the keyboards and build these configurations out for our customers. And then lastly, we offer managed services where we can actually operate those environments for our customers. So that just gives you a little sense in terms of the capabilities that REAN Cloud has and what we do. So in terms of our approach, sorry, the mouse is a little sensitive this morning. In terms of our approach, we really focus on kind of this adoption process. We're big believers in a test-driven approach. Fail fast is kind of our mantra. We're very much proponents of leveraging automation to do these things in a very repeatable, efficient, consistent process. And not only as part of the deployment, but we like to apply that automation to the operations as well. And then overall, especially as DevOps is concerned, we're focused on being able to provide metrics. And not just where you think about monitoring your environment and making sure things are working well from an environment perspective, but really how is the organization doing from a DevOps process. And so we like to incorporate cost metrics. We like to incorporate program management, project management metrics in terms of how the teams are working. Certainly the health of the environment comes into play. And so really we've got some capabilities around how we present that information to our customers so they can really understand from an organizational perspective how things are running. And this is something specifically that we did with Gigamon, and we're able to provide that component for them. And then, of course, running across all this always is the focus on security, and certainly for our customers in the regulated world is compliance. So from there, one of the things I want to highlight from a REAN Cloud offering and something that's very relevant to what we did for Gigamon is we have, over the years, built a series of tools, and we're at a point now where we've been able to refine them into a consistent framework. And these are tools that our cloud engineers and our folks who are out in the field have been using to help our customers deploy these environments in an automated fashion, and then bring that automation from a testing perspective to verify what's been deployed. And then ultimately, as I mentioned in the previous slide, being able to manage those environments. And so what you see here is this REAN Cloud Accelerator framework, and each of those elements that in that represent a specific module in that framework. And we're going to talk specifically about the deploy module, which is something that we used in our work with Gigamon. This is a GUI-driven environment that allows us to create the infrastructure that's required for our customers on the cloud. And so we've got the resources that are available from AWS. We can go in and configure those resources and deploy those from this environment. So it's very much a GUI-driven drag and drop type environment, and provides us a very efficient way to do the automation and bring these customers onto the cloud. And so at the end of the day, the output from this is really infrastructure as code. And having that code comes into play in terms of making this repeatable. And there's a theme there that I'll get back to when we get into the specifics of what we did for Gigamon. So let's start with Gigamon. So first of all, I think it's important to understand, who Gigamon is. Maybe not everybody's familiar with them. Gigamon is, they describe their solution as data in motion. They're focused on the data in motion. And what they mean by that is collecting network data and being able to analyze that, as well as share it with other partners that could take advantage of that data for traffic analysis, for intrusion detection. You can, I'm sure, fill in the blanks there in terms of the areas that they provide value. Traditionally, their solutions, and we've got the little picture of the orange boxes there, have been appliance-based, where they connect into taps or spanning ports on different network elements to collect that network data and provide that solution. And so their customers, which by the way, they've got over 80 of the Fortune 100s, so they're pretty widely deployed at large enterprises around the world. But their customers, several years ago, were coming to them and saying, "Hey, we're moving to, a hybrid approach, to an all-in cloud approach. We want to leverage your solutions in those environments." And so they were being pushed, and I'm sure they realized it, that they needed to have a cloud-based solution. And so what their challenge was to get their developers who had traditionally been working in this physical environment and had a wonderful development center in California, and had all the resources at their fingertips to be able to physically configure environments and do the development work they needed. They needed that same type of infrastructure on the cloud. And so they went out on their own and had some people in-house that had some experience with the cloud and could configure some environments. Those developers who didn't necessarily have that experience, they kind of leveraged their friends and their co-developers to spin up these environments. And really, at the end of the day, what ended up happening, as you can, I'm sure, imagine, is they ran into a number of challenges. I think, if you were to ask them in hindsight, you really don't want to give your developers the freedom to set up their own AWS environments, because that's obviously going to lead to each developer is going to set their environments up differently. They're going to be prone to exposing different security vulnerabilities, different access points that allow entry into their network. And so they came and reached out to REAN Cloud, and we got connected with them to be able to focus on how they could actually bring some normalization to this, bring some consistency to this, The security team there at Gigamon was very focused in making sure that they had a tight solution. But at the end of the day, they couldn't limit their developers to the point that they weren't able to do their jobs and build out these development VPCs that they needed to be able to configure their solution. Okay. All right. So in terms of that, I think we've covered all that. All right. So the solution we focused on was helping them define this fast automated solution that would allow them to do this. And every developer, the way they did their development needed a dedicated VPC to do their development, and so we had to take that into account. And again, to address the security team's focus, they needed to have control, and so we came up with this concept of a control VPC that was really a centralized component that we could put all of the security resources into and provide some consistency there. All right. So the process involved setting up this control VPC, being able to support VPCs to a variety of different locations, having an orchestration component that allowed us to automate that. We wanted to take advantage of the resources that Palo Alto Networks had in terms of the automation that Matt just talked about, and leveraging the bootstrapping to build out the VM series for Gigamon. And really, specific to Palo Alto, Gigamon was a Palo Alto customer from way back and had been using their solutions in their on-prem environment, in their development centers and their offices. And so Palo Alto Networks was going to be part of the solution no matter what. Their security department was very familiar and comfortable with it. Their IT folks were familiar with it from a configuration perspective, and their networking folks were familiar with it. So that made that part of the puzzle pretty easy. So this is a picture of the final solution that we came up with. And so I'm just going to walk you through this at a high level initially so you have an idea of the end game here, and then we'll walk through how we kind of built to get to this final picture. So what you see in the right corner here is the control VPC. And this is an architecture that we've deployed for a number of different customers. In that control VPC, the concept is that we want to group together a variety of shared resources. That can be management resources, monitoring, as well as security components. And so that's where we put the VM series from Palo Alto Networks. And then hanging off of that are, on the left-hand side and kind of working our way around, are the individual developer VPCs that they were able to create. This is kind of a skinny down snapshot of that. But you've got individual developer VPCs on the left side in one region, and then also additional developer VPCs in separate regions. They needed the flexibility to be able to spin these up in different regions for a variety of reasons, including sometimes the AWS releases certain capabilities in one region, US East, before it necessarily is available in some of the others. So they wanted that flexibility to be able to support that. And then on the bottom right-hand corner, we've got the connection back to Gigamon's development center in California, where the developers were actually sitting. So we've got the connection back to that. All right. All right. So in terms of how we build this and how we approached it, we focused on a layered approach, and really the foundation layer was the actual control VPC that we were going to host these shared resources in. And to build that out, we leveraged the REAN deploy module I spoke about a few minutes ago to be able to build that infrastructure as code. Now, we could have used CloudFormation or Terraform, but we're REAN Cloud and we're using our tools for a lot of good reasons to be able to do this pretty efficiently for our customers. And so REAN deploy was the framework we used to build out the infrastructure and then go ahead and deploy that. So we've got the foundation VPC that supports the shared elements in the control layer. From here, well, actually, this is a snapshot of the actual GUI from the REAN deploy tool that we use. And again, drag and drop capabilities. This allows us to push out the individual resources that we're going to take advantage of, and then go ahead and configure all those elements. And at the end of the day, we can do this in a very repeatable fashion for our customers. So once we had the foundation VPC, the control VPC there, then it was a matter of layering in the network components that would be required to support the VM series. And so as part of that, we configured those and pushed those out. Now, here lies the first challenge and something that we came up with, we think of as a fairly elegant solution. The challenge was, because we realized we were going to need to be deploying, we wanted the flexibility to be able to deploy multiple VM series in a consistent fashion. But when you deploy these resources, specifically the ENIs and so forth, AWS is going to assign them the IP address, and we didn't want to have to limit with static IP. We didn't want to have to be burdened with managing static IP addresses and trying to control that. And so we came up with a solution that actually allowed us to go ahead and deploy those individual components that required the IP addresses, and then leverage a orchestrator, and in our case we chose Jenkins, but alternatively we could have used Lambda, or we could have used a simple workflow potentially as a solution, but in this case we went with Jenkins, and we leveraged Jenkins to be able to go out and actually pull those IP addresses from the network configuration for what was deployed. And ultimately, this is what we were going to use in the configurations that we were going to deploy for the VM series. And so Jenkins was our orchestrator. It allowed us to go out and pull those and pull those back to be able to address that challenge. From there, we went forward, and we needed to be able to figure out where to put those IP addresses in the actual configuration for the VM series. And one of the tricks we used for that process was actually manually going in and configuring the firewall, and then being able to actually export the configuration from the firewall. And so using the tools that Palo Alto Networks provides, we're able to actually export that, and it generates XML code that we're able to use. And so here we've got a picture on the left-hand side of the output, and on the right-hand side we actually used Ruby ERB from a templating perspective to be able to define the parameters where those actual IP addresses would get pushed into. And this ultimately would get pushed back to be used as part of the bootstrap. And so we had this configuration. We manually configured it, generated the XML code, used Ruby to templatize it, and then we're able to define the parameters to push those IP addresses that Jenkins had been able to pull back. So now we've got the correct information in the bootstrap, and so to make it available to the VM series, we actually stored it in S3 buckets. And so the concept is that it would behave very similarly to what you would have if you had a USB thumb drive with the bootstrap and you were plugging it into a physical Palo Alto Networks firewall. The same concept here. We pointed the Palo Alto, the VM series, to those S3 buckets to be able to pull that bootstrap and configure the VM series. And a couple of things related to that we learned as part of the process. We had to have the correct directory structure that the code was looking for. Even though we didn't necessarily have information in all these directories, we learned pretty quickly that we needed to mimic that directory structure. And so within the config directory, we were able to store this updated bootstrap with the correct IP addresses that had been deployed for the networking within the VPC, and boom, point the Palo Alto to that, point the VM series to it, and as we provision the instances, they go pull from the S3 buckets, they pull the bootstrap and begin to go ahead and configure the VM series. And so from that, they're able to lay the foundation for HA, although they're not able to, the bootstrap doesn't allow you to fully configure it, but it puts in some of the components that we're going to leverage to be able to do that. It also, from the bootstrap, we're able to create the VPN back to the Palo Alto, or back to the Gigamon Development Center in California. And we're also able to deploy a set of rules, security rules, so that those are configured in a proper fashion as per the requirements of Gigamon's security organization. And so the bootstrapping really had a really powerful impact on creating a secure VM series with a solid configuration right off the bat. And so, you know, as Matt highlighted, that's a great feature that they've got to be able to do that. And so this is the way we're able to do it on the cloud. All right. So at this point now, we are actually connected from the control VPC to Palo Alto Networks. To Gigamon's offices in California. And so now the next piece in the puzzle is, okay, how do we actually allow the developers to be able to configure the VPCs that they're going to need to do the development? And so here again, we leveraged the orchestrator, leveraged Jenkins, and part of what it did, actually I jumped a step forward there before I should have. The next step here was actually to leverage Jenkins to configure the HA on those VM series. As I mentioned, the bootstrap, we were able to put some of the foundation components that we needed to be able to take advantage of it, but in order to actually configure it, we leveraged the XML API that Matt talked about a few minutes ago, and with Jenkins, used that interface to be able to go in and actually configure the VM series to allow it to do the HA that was required. And so that's really a powerful feature to be able to take advantage of if folks aren't familiar with that. So now we've got the configuration solid in terms of the VM series. We're ready to go, and now we're able to focus on the developers. And so as part of that, the developers needed the ability to be able to go out and deploy these VPCs for their development efforts. And so here again, we leveraged a combination of REAN deploy with the images for those for the AWS infrastructure for those VPCs. We leveraged Jenkins to be able to orchestrate the steps that needed to happen to be able to configure those environments. And so the developers were actually able to go in and through Jenkins instantiate a VPC for their development environment, but by providing very little information. Essentially, they had to provide their name and select the type of VPC development VPC they wanted. So we really focused on leveraging as much automation as we could to be able to minimize the work on the developer and the amount of information they would have to put in. You know, CIDR blocks was one of the things we had to kind of work our way around. And so we actually leveraged automation. The Palo Alto Network, or the Gigamon folks, the networking team there had given us the blocks that we could use, and we actually had automated the deployment of those. And so when a developer went to select their environment, they were told what CIDR blocks they got, and they accepted it and moved forward. And as developers kind of worked through and we tore down environments after they were done doing their development, then those blocks would go back into the pool that we could pull from. And so that was kind of an elegant way, leveraging the automation that we were able to really minimize the effort on the developer to be able to configure that environment. I mean, it really was true that they were able to actually click and deploy one of these. And so between the combination of deploying it and setting up the actual VPN back to Gigamon's offices, all that was completely automated for them. And so now we turn them loose and let them start going ahead and deploying these environments. You know, and frankly, they were able to spin these up in, you know, between 5 and 10 minutes to be able to make that happen. And so, you know, really was the power of automation to be able to pull that together and allow them to do that. And because everything was flowing through the control VPC with the VM series there, we were providing a very robust, secure solution to allow them to do that. So the automation and the orchestration also cared for when they were done with an environment. This was one of the original problems that Gigamon had because they turned their developers loose and they were able to spin up environments. Well, naturally, they weren't tearing down environments as quickly as they should have. And so, you know, costs were starting to get a little bit out of hand, and there was really no cleanup effort to tear down those environments. So part of the automation, in addition to being able to stand up the environments, the automation also cared for the tear down of those environments. Okay, and so at this point, developers are able to kind of spin these environments up, and you start to see, you know, building out additional environments with the clicks. We, as I mentioned, I think in the beginning here, we had to be able to support regional, different regions, and so that's cared for as part of the solution. And so we've got that covered from a deployment perspective. So really, that in a nutshell is what we were able to accomplish for Gigamon. At the end of the day, I think they realized that having this consistency, being able to limit what the developer could do in terms of going off and creating one-off environments, we were able to control a lot of the security parameters, both within the AWS environment, you know, from IAM permissions, as well as provide the rules in a consistent fashion for the VM series. And so the security department was quite pleased with it. And frankly, the developers were pleased because they didn't all have to become cloud experts. They essentially could quickly spin up an environment, a VPC development environment, and go ahead and get their work done. And so, you know, all in all, I think it was pretty successful, and we certainly are quite pleased with it. And from what we hear from our friends at Gigamon, they've been quite pleased with it. So hopefully that was helpful in terms of walking you through the approach and how we were able to accomplish that. Just in terms of, you know, I think I did a decent overview of what REAN Cloud could bring, but in terms of ideas, if you're looking to take this to the next step, certainly we're available to help customers do a design for these types of environments to address these issues. We do a lot of security assessments for existing environments or for existing deployments on AWS. And of course, building out these environments, this is where we spend a great deal of our time. We've had a lot of activity around building secure foundations that allow customers to start to do their work and bring their workloads into the cloud. And so this is an area where we've done a great deal of work. And we've gotten to the point now where we've been able to leverage our REAN Deploy module and build actual full-blown blueprints that allow us to reuse that and essentially do things in a much quicker fashion for our customers. So that's really what REAN Cloud can bring. Matt, I think maybe you wanted to highlight some things from a Palo Alto Networks perspective.
Sure. Yes. Thanks, John. That was a great overview. REAN Cloud and Palo Alto Networks are going hand in hand and working with a lot of the customers who need to move to the cloud. You know, if you wanted to get started and play around with the VM series, you can do so directly from Marketplace. There's a 15-day free trial available for 2 bundles, and they are both annual and hourly subscriptions. There's also the bring your own license option, which is a more traditional purchase model. So if you're already a partner or a customer of Palo Alto Networks, you can execute the effort on that in that angle. But either way, it's pretty easy to spin up an environment and get started. There's a wealth of different templates and CloudFormation templates and scripts that we've posted on our template page on the GitHub repository. So if you are a user of GitHub, you can search for Palo Alto Networks AWS, and you'll find a lot of different examples to get started. One that might be appropriate is the hybrid deployment example that deploys a web server, a database, and a firewall in your account and allows you to poke around and get started pretty quickly. With that, I think we're going to throw it open to questions.
Cool deal. Yeah, we got a couple of questions while you guys were going through that. One of the questions was which region do you guys deploy this automation into, and then a follow-up onto that would be, would it work in GovCloud, and have you tried it there?
So this is John from REAN Cloud. This was actually deployed primarily in US West, but we did have, as I mentioned, developers were allowed to gen up development VPCs in other regions. Specifically for Gigamon, we didn't do GovCloud. But we are doing a fair amount of GovCloud work, automating other types of scenarios, not specifically. Actually, we're doing it with Palo Alto Networks. It's somewhat different. It's not the development VPC scenario, but certainly we are doing automation in GovCloud with Palo Alto Networks.
Yes, from the Palo Alto Networks perspective, as that slide indicated, the BYOL is currently supported in GovCloud and Marketplace. We're going through the validation to where the Marketplace, the VM series, will be supported in the new GovCloud Marketplace. And
another question just came in, which is, what's the timeline for A to Z for this second deployment? Do this again for probably another customer.
So this is John again from REAN Cloud. I think for this project it was about a 4-month total, but that having been able to blueprint what we've done, we can expect that to be, I would say, significantly less. But that was really end-to-end design, testing, some post-production support, as part of a full-blown project.
And these spoke development VPCs, how did they get access to the internet? Was it through internet in the VPC, through the control VPC, or did they come back on-prem?
They came back on-prem.
Okay.
And that was part of the requirements in terms of being able to secure it. And in fact, we limited, from a permission perspective, what a developer could do within their VPC in terms of establishing any connectivity from the VPC to the public internet. So that was part of the security controls that we were able to implement.
Okay, and I know I've been working with Palo Alto from a partner perspective for a couple of years now, and that's one of the actual big use cases for Palo Alto firewalls on AWS is to actually prevent from having to go on-prem, because a lot of folks need to have some sort of firewall to have any sort of internet access. So it's sort of a different sort of mind of thinking. There's a whole other sort of set of architectures we can use. There's auto-scaling solutions, there's route-based solutions, there's network interface and VPN solutions that we didn't really touch on too much during this, but that are really applicable, actually.
Yeah, Nick, I can add to that. To your point, we do have customers that are doing similar approaches for DevOps, and rather than backhaul all the developers through corporate to get to resources like GitHub or other developer resources, what can be done is you can actually set very specific outbound policies that allow them only access to those particular websites and/or resources. So you're limiting you're limiting their access directly to the internet, but you're also cutting down on the backhaul traffic that goes back through corporate. So we do have some customers that are taking care of that. There is a question that I wanted to answer around the dynamic security policies. They wanted me to go into a little bit more detail. So AWS, you can use up to 25 tags. The VM series, or PAN-OS, if you will, our operating system, can consume up to 25 tags in AWS. So what happens there is you would create a security policy. Rather than creating a security policy based on the individual workload IP addresses, you would create a security policy based on an address group. We'll call it web servers. And the criteria for that web server might be the operating system, the location, and the application. So it's web servers. So what would happen there is you would create that dynamic address group, and as those resources are added or removed that fulfill those three criteria, the policy is dynamically updated, right? So you're adding resources that it learns the IP address dynamically in the security policy, and that security policy is updated. You remove the resource, and the reverse happens. So dynamic, it sounds like you're familiar with PAN-OS and the VM series. So if you search for dynamic address groups on the live community site, you can easily find it. And dynamic address groups is actually supported across all hardware and virtualized instances.
Cool. There's another question here about VM series support HA across AZs. That one's, it depends on your deployment model. So there's a deployment model where you can sort of cluster firewalls within the same AZ and then move a network interface, which would move the IP addresses, sort of like a, a failover scenario. That is one possibility. It does sort of restrict you to a single availability zone. Otherwise, there's other multi-HA or multi-AZ sort of HA environments that either use load balancing. The load balancing natively goes across AZs, or you can do things like route shifting or EIP shifting, which allow you to get a little more detail around multi-AZ.
Yeah, to delve down a little bit more into that, Nick, we do support your traditional active-passive failover in a single AZ. That is supported now. We actually do recommend you use the load balancing angle that allows you to select a max and min firewall of 1. And each one of those firewalls is then deployed across availability zones in auto-scaling groups. And so what we're doing there is we're taking full advantage of the AWS infrastructure and the self-healing nature of the auto-scaling groups to deliver the exact same type of failover that you want, that you're familiar with in your data center, but it's a little bit more cloud-centric.
And then there was a question about VPC-A, VPC-B, and the diagram going over an internet gateway to the public zone. They said it seemed like you would be using a VPN. Was it not using a VPN, or how did that work?
No, it was using a VPN.
Okay.
I'm trying to recall that diagram, yeah.
Okay. Let's see here. There was a question about how do you make resources in a dev spoke publicly available without an internet gateway. If you want to cover that one real quick. I think the answer there is basically uses the internet, right? It basically uses the internet on premises to do that, to ingress anything publicly available in the VPCs, right?
Yeah, I think you got that one.
Yeah, because there was a comment that you run into a network interface and elastic IP address limit that you can run into when you allow instances to be publicly available through the firewall, which is true. You can have up to 30 IP addresses per interface on a firewall, and we have larger instance type support 8, or I think in some cases 16 interfaces, so you are sort of limited to the amount of IP addresses you can use in that model, which is again why we sort of recommend to use a load balancing model when possible, especially with the new network load balancer, which has a static IP per AZ. That makes it much easier to sort of keep track of that sort of stuff. there was with this issue scale across different AWS accounts. I assume so, right? Because VPN can go across accounts pretty easily. So
exactly.
Let's see here. So there was a different question. How many VPCs does this scale out to? So how many developer VPCs would this scale to?
So what we were experiencing was between 20 and 30 on average, and when we reached that 30 mark, what we were able to do is just deploy another set of VM series within that control VPC, and then off to the races for another 20 or 30.
Okay. Did you have to deal with any big file transfers, and what was the performance like?
Yeah, so we did, you know, as you can imagine, with all the traffic data coming back, there's a fair amount of data flowing around. And our experience was really there were no challenges. I think it really was dependent upon the instance size of the VM series. That was the point where we were able to kind of map that out and just give it a bigger instance size to be able to deal with more loads.
Sure. And there's a question: if you have services like Wildfire, you know, app threats, do those features do a check now and download it, install time is spin up?
So when you build the bootstrapping file, bootstrapping image, it will include all of the threat subscriptions and connections to things like Wildfire. So the answer can be yes. So if you do configure it with threat prevention and Wildfire, yes, the VM series will do a check back to the licensing server to confirm validity.
Okay, it looks like we've got time for one more. It says, how do you allow a public instance to be available through the firewall? You guys want to give a shot at that one, or I can talk a little about that one too.
Go ahead, Nick.
Okay, yeah, you know, like I said, there's a couple different ways to do it. You can put a private address on your public instances, and then you put the public address on the firewall itself, and the firewall would basically do a NAT to that address. You know, that runs into, like I said, some scalability challenges after if you're trying to do something more than like a /24 through there. You can also do the load balancing approach, where you know, you either have a DNS name or an IP address that goes to a load balancer, which then feeds into the firewalls. And so then those would then forward the traffic based upon basically a NAT rule, or by looking up some of the HTTP information and forwarding it over to the right locations. You can also do this where the public IP address comes in through your on-premises, and it sort of has to hairpin through either VPNs or direct connects to get back into AWS. So there's a number of different ways for that to work. So I think we're out of time here. Matt, or either of you guys have any sort of parting words?
Nope. Just thanks everyone for their time, and please feel free to visit the resources we discussed. A quick resource for Palo Alto Networks is aws.paloaltonetworks.com.
Yeah, this is John.
All right.
Thanks everyone for your time. Appreciate it.